Okay, so I'm doing a lot of DJI Action 6 content at the moment. I'm a bit conscious that the channel's going to end up being the DJI Action 6 channel. I don't want that to become the case. But I have been seeing quite a few things around the internet and a lot of myths again about how the Action 6 performs, particularly versus other cameras. Now, one video in particular kind of got my goat a little bit because it was a significant YouTuber, very well respected, and quite a large following. And he compared the Action 6 to the Ace Pro 2 and the GoPro, and also the Action 5. Now, there was quite a lot to go into in the video that he did, and there was a lot of stuff that I could bring up, but in particular, he did a low light test, and it's funny for me to keep going on about low light because to me, it is still a fairly niche use for the camera, but I do understand now that people are using these things in all kinds of conditions, and it does apply even in mountain biking if you go into a dingy forest and all that. So it is kind of important. Interestingly, when he compared all of the cameras together, the Ace Pro 2 was showing a brighter exposure in low light and better stabilization than the Action 6. Now, I've used the Action 6 in very low light in the standard recording mode, and the stabilization has been generally pretty good. Now, he didn't state what picture profile he was using. I think you should state what mode you're using, so I wasn't completely sure whether he was using the pure video mode on the Ace Pro 2 and the super night mode, but I think he was using the standard recording, the non-low light mode, to do this test. And he went inside his car, and the Action 6 was showing a lower exposure. Now, when we talk about physics in terms of the aperture of these cameras, it's pretty much impossible for the Action 6 to get a lower exposure for the same settings in low light than the Ace Pro 2. The Ace Pro 2 has, I think it's an f2.6 lens, so it's slightly brighter than most other Action cameras, but it's still nowhere near as wide an aperture as the f2 on the Action 6. So right from the off, it's almost impossible for the Action 6 to get a lower exposure in low light than the Ace Pro 2. So I thought, okay, I'm going to test this myself. So I went out in my car in a very similar situation to the one that this particular influencer used, and no, I'm not going to name it who it is because I don't want to get into all that. But I went in my own car, drove around a bit with the two cameras, the Ace Pro 2 and the Action 6, next to each other. And so this is what I found. Okay, so I want to show you these two comparison shots between the Ace Pro 2 and the DJI Action 6, and I'm using the default color profile. I didn't want to go into log modes. The DJI can have 10-bit color, D-Log M. The Ace Pro 2 can use iLog, which I'm not particularly impressed with, and it doesn't have 10-bit color. But what I wanted to do was compare them as equally as I could. So I put them into the standard color profile. I've reduced the sharpness on both of them to 0, but I've also reduced the noise reduction on the Action 6 to 0 as well. I want to see what can be brought out of the camera. The Ace Pro 2 doesn't allow you to do this, so that again is a negative for the Ace Pro 2. So let's take a look at the two of these cameras. Now, right off the bat, we can see that the exposure on the Action 6 is slightly brighter than that of the Ace Pro 2. We can also see that my face is more crisp, there's more detail in my beard, there's some blurriness going on in the Ace Pro 2 because it can't use as fast a shutter speed. Now, I get that normally, if you want to do a kind of filmy look with the cameras, you would set it to, you'd have 24p and you'd have 1/48 of a shutter to get natural motion blur. It's not what we're looking at here. What I've done in this test is I left the stabilization on both the cameras on because I wanted to see how the low light affected that. Normally, if I'm mounting in a car or to to an object, I will turn the stabilization on the cameras off. I find it a bit odd to have that kind of floaty look of stabilization when you've mounted the camera to a solid object like a car dashboard or whatever. So that's a scenario, and immediately you can see how much crisper the detail looks in the Action 6. And we look at the texture on the seat here, look at the rain droplets on the back of my car along with all the dirty windscreen and everything. The Ace Pro 2, it seems, is treating these water droplets like noise, so it's getting rid of them. But yeah, you can see a lot more detail in the dark areas on the Action 6, and this is what frustrates me a lot about this particular influencer that I saw. It's pretty much impossible to get a lower exposure or a darker exposure for the same settings on the Action 6 as the Ace Pro 2, because there is simply much more light going into the camera. You know, that is just a fact. Now, the Ace Pro 2 has an f2.6 lens. It's a slight outlier compared with other Action cameras, so it has a slightly more open aperture than most other Action cameras. But even still, the Action 6 still has significantly more light going into it, so it is objectively, physically impossible for it to really have a darker exposure in the same lighting conditions and the same camera settings as the Ace Pro 2. So that's for one thing, and that's what I really couldn't understand. As soon as I saw this influencer's video, and as I say, he has a significant following in this kind of sphere, and he had a darker exposure on the Action 6. It didn't sit right with me. It just didn't add up to my own experience of it. And when he showed the stabilization in low light, it was also not very good on the Action 6. So I really don't know what on earth he'd done with the camera. I can't prove that he'd purposefully set up the camera to look bad compared with the Ace Pro 2. I can't prove that, but something was off about his camera setting. It just didn't add up. So as we can see here, yes, the noise is quite a lot on the Action 6, but you know, we can deal with that. You know, I've got some noise reduction on here, which I added a bit earlier. And, you know, you can still see the detail in the texture of the seat, and just up here on the headrest, there's just so much more detail and exposure on the Action 6. We go along a bit. Again, every time you look at the Ace Pro 2, there's either some motion blur or it's just mushy. The detail just isn't there. And you know, you could say that the Action 6 looks a bit more electronic, and maybe it does, but even then I can still soften this off a little bit in Resolve. You don't always have to sharpen, you can actually go the other way as well. But I'm just looking at mainly the exposure detail. In D-Log M, I think I could get a better result in terms of, you know, the natural detail and stuff on the Action 6, but the important thing here is that looking at both of them in isolation on their default settings, and you can see out here the tree, look at the detail in those leaves, look at the water droplets again on the windscreen compared with the Ace Pro 2. It seems very odd to me that this particular influencer ended up with a lower exposure and worse stabilization on the Action 6 without purposefully setting it up to do that. Now, I'm not going to mention the name of the influencer or the YouTube channel. I don't want to get into that kind of thing, but I just want to show you, because, you know, a lot of you guys might have watched his video and, you know, you might respect him and think that he's somebody you can listen to and get an objective view from. And looking at his comments, you know, people do. But I was very surprised by what he was showing from the Action 6. And, you know, again, we can see on here, there's just far more detail, crisper detail in the image on the Action 6 than there is on the Ace Pro 2. And I'm not saying the Ace Pro 2 is a bad camera, it's not. So yeah, as you can see, there is a big difference between the two, and it flies in the face of what that particular influencer was showing on their video. I can't prove that they set up the Action 6 for a fail, but it's looking a bit suspicious to me, because you can see for yourselves, I'm showing you in Resolve, I'm showing you the raw footage, untouched footage as it came out of the camera, and you can just see there's just so much more detail on the Action 6. Okay, so you've seen me demonstrate quite comprehensively that the Action 6 does have a better low light performance in the standard recording mode than the Ace Pro 2. Now, I haven't done a full stabilization test. I probably need to go for a run or something in low light to see if the Ace Pro 2 does any better. But you can see from the car shot that there is way more detail. It's more crisp. Yes, it is noisy, but the only reason the Ace Pro 2 isn't noisy is because it's using a massive amount of in-camera noise reduction. I could ramp the noise reduction up on the Action 6, but it would turn the image to mush. I wanted to see what I could get out of these cameras in the standard recording mode together, and I used the -2 setting on the noise on the Action 6 because I wanted to bring out as much detail as I can. But that wasn't really the focus of the test. The focus of the test was more the exposure, what the cameras were showing in the exposure overall. And you can see that the Action 6 was showing much more shadow detail than the Ace Pro 2. I had them on exactly the same settings. They were both to 0 EV, default color profiles on both of them. As I say, I just reduced the sharpness down on both cameras and reduce the noise reduction to 0 to -2 on the Action 6. And as I mentioned during the resolve segment, I can't prove that the influencer in question purposefully set up the Action 6 to a lower exposure to make it look bad, but it's a little bit suspicious given that I haven't been able to replicate that situation in my own testing. Now, something else he brought up regarding low light was he mentioned another significant influencer who had apparently demonstrated that the Action 6 wasn't as good in low light as the Action 5. Now, anyone who's watched my review video can see, again, that's nonsense. And I'm going to reiterate the lens thing. The Action 6 is letting in almost double the amount of light onto the sensor than the Action 5. It is almost physically impossible for it to have worse low light performance than the Action 5, just from that alone. But as I've demonstrated in my review video, there is objectively more shadow detail in the low light image of the Action 6 than the Action 5. And as I said in that video, anyone who is saying otherwise, I'm afraid either doesn't know what they're talking about or they are not being honest with you. Let's put it that way. So anyway, I just wanted to make this quick video. I say it's a quick video, I've waffled on, but I'm going to do a video later on the week where I'm going to go through some of the comments that people have left on my various videos and expand on them, on the answers that I've given to people. But yeah, I'll see you in that video, and I hope this has been of some use to you as well. So anyway, again, if you do like what I'm doing, and like and subscribe, and share the love, share the video around if you so wish, and I'll see you in the next video.